Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read from Exodus 3 and talk about whether or not God is our Heavenly Daddy. Over the last few years and decades there's been a tendency in Christianity to think about God as a best friend, and people want to have an intimate relationship with God, and there's this picture of snuggling and cuddling with our Heavenly Daddy. What we're going to learn from Exodus 3 is that there's a huge gap between God's existence and our existence. And we're also going to learn that God is an authority figure. And so it really is not correct for us to think about God as our heavenly, snuggly daddy. Now, before we get into Exodus 3, let's set some context. This is a timeline of world history. We obviously live out here beyond 2000 AD. We're going to read from the book of Exodus, which tells us about events that took place between 1900 BC and about 1400 BC. But we're going to start in Genesis 4. Now, if you start at the very beginning of Genesis and start reading, we read about creation. God created the universe and everything in it, and then He created Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had two sons named Cain and Abel, and Cain killed Abel, and then they had a son named Seth, and that's where we're going to start reading. And again, this is from Genesis 4, starting at verse 25. Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed Abel. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of Yahweh. Now let's talk a little bit about names. We have the name here, Seth, and in this culture, names had meaning. Names meant things. Names told you something about the person. In this case, the Hebrew word that is translated Seth is the same Hebrew word that is translated appointed. And so what happened here is when Eve gave birth to Seth, she said, well, God appointed me an offspring in place of Abel, and so she named this son Appointed, because Seth and appointed are the same thing. Now keep that in mind as we go through today's video, that names meant things in their culture. Names told you something about the person. Now we also have down here a reference to the name of God. And it says, then men began to call upon the name of Yahweh. And what this tells us is after Enosh was born is when men began to use the name Yahweh to refer to God. Now, if names meant things in their culture, and if names told you something about God, then we need to understand the word Yahweh in order to understand why men began calling God Yahweh. Now, let's look at a chart to understand Yahweh. In the English language, we have a verb called to be, and in singular, first person is I am, second person is you are, and third person is he is. And then in plural, we have we are, you are, and they are. Yahweh is the Hebrew version of the third person singular. So Yahweh means he is. If you want to be very technical, Yahweh actually means he continually is. So the question is, why did men name God He is? Well, let's think of it this way. As humans, we have a natural tendency to ask where we came from. A lot of people do genealogical research. They find out who their parents are, who their grandparents are, who their grandparents and great-grandparents, and they keep going back. And if you think about that in this context, we have Enosh, and if you ask, well, where did Enosh come from? Enosh was brought into existence by Seth. Where did Seth come from? Seth was brought into existence by Adam. Where did Adam come from? Adam was brought into existence by God. Now, what's the next logical question? The next question is, where did God come from? Now, what's the answer to that? Well, the answer is, God simply is. God has no beginning. God was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And so when you ask the question, well, where did God come from? The answer is God is. He is. God continually is. And that is why, after Enosh was born, I believe that men understood this truth about God, and so they began to call him Yahweh. When they referred to God, they referred to the one who continually is, the one who was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. Now again, keep that in mind as we get into today's passage in Exodus. So after Seth and Enosh were born, then men began to multiply on the earth, and then Genesis tells us about the flood that God brought and destroyed the earth. The Bible tells us that Noah and his sons and their wives survived the flood in an ark. After the flood, men began to multiply again, and they built the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was probably built in this area somewhere. And at the Tower of Babel, God confused the language of all the people so that they would scatter. And Noah had 3 sons. The descendants of Shem went this direction and became Asians. The descendants of Japheth went this direction and became Europeans. And the descendants of Ham went this direction and became Africans. And so that gives us the 3 basic people groups that we see around the earth today. Out of the descendants of Shem was a man named Abram, who was born in Ur of the Chaldees. Genesis tells us that Abram was born, and then God told him and his family to move, so they moved up to Haran for a little bit and then down into Canaan. While in Canaan, Abram had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. Jacob was also named Israel, and so Jacob and his 12 sons and their descendants became known as the Israelites. We are told at the end of Genesis that Jacob and his sons and their wives and children moved from Canaan down to Egypt because of a famine. And so at the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, the Israelites are in Egypt. When we start reading Exodus with the Israelites in Egypt, we read that the Israelites were prosperous, they multiplied, they became very numerous. The Egyptians began to fear the Israelites because the Egyptians were afraid that the Israelites become more numerous than the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians turned the Israelites into slaves. It was during that time that a man named Moses was born in Egypt. Now Moses was an Israelite, but he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And so Moses was raised as part of the Egyptian royal family. He was raised in the Egyptian court. But when Moses was an adult, he went out and he looked at his fellow Israelites and he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Israelites. And so Moses killed the Egyptian. Pharaoh found out about that, so Pharaoh tried to kill Moses. That forced Moses to flee from Egypt over to Midian. He had to flee for his life. Moses settled in Midian. He got married and had children. And one day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law out in the wilderness, and Moses saw a burning bush. And that's where we're going to start reading in the book of Exodus in chapter 3. And this is Exodus 3, verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and Moses looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. Now notice, not consumed. The bush was burning, but it wasn't consumed. So obviously that would have gotten Moses' attention. Obviously something unusual, something miraculous was happening here. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When Yahweh saw that Moses turned aside to look, God called to Moses from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Now notice God called to Moses from the midst of the bush. What this tells us is that God and Moses were face to face here at this burning bush. So Moses, and that tells us Moses met Yahweh face to face, one-on-one. Verse 5, Then God said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now this idea of removing sandals is a little strange in our culture, but we actually do something very similar. In our culture, when we play the national anthem, we stand and men remove their hats. If we're in a social situation and we're sitting down and somebody else walks up and we're introduced to somebody that we don't know, we stand up. And why? Why do we stand for the national anthem? Why do we stand to greet people? It's because standing and removing hats is a sign of respect. Well, likewise, in their culture, removing their sandals was the way they expressed respect. And that's what God was demanding here. Now, verse 6. God said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now notice, God said, I am God. God also identified himself as the God of Moses' father, also the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then notice the word afraid. When Moses realized that he was talking to God, Moses was afraid. Then Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, the Israelites, who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. Now again, Moses is over here in Midian, where the burning bush is. The Israelites are still in Egypt and they're slaves. And so Yahweh is telling Moses that he's aware of what's happening to his fellow Israelites over in Egypt. Yahweh continued talking to Moses. So I have come down to deliver the Israelites from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land of Egypt to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. So God is telling Moses that he's going to bring the Israelites from Egypt up to the land of Canaan. God continued, Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. So again, Moses is over here in Midian. God is telling Moses that he's going to send Moses from Midian over to Egypt so that Moses can talk to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt back up to the land of Canaan. Verse 11. Now, notice the word but. Moses did not really like this plan, and so this is Moses' first objection. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? Now, Moses asked, Who am I? Basically, Moses was arguing that he was not qualified to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And indeed, at this particular time, Moses was a shepherd. However, who was Moses? Moses had grown up as the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses grew up as part of the royal family. Moses grew up in the Egyptian court. And so Moses understood the protocol of the Egyptian court. Moses would have known some of the members of the royal family. And so Moses was very well qualified to go lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But Moses' objection was that he was nobody. God said to Moses, Certainly I will be with you, Moses, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. So God essentially said to Moses that God would be with him. Now, verse 13, this is Moses' second objection. Then Moses said to God, Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now the Israelites may say to me, What is God's name? Then Moses said to God, What shall I say to the Israelites? Now, one of the difficulties of understanding the Bible, particularly the Old Testament sometimes, is understanding the quotations. Many times in the Bible we have quotations within quotations within quotations. And that's partly what we have going on here. So it says, Moses said to God. So these two lines here is what Moses said to God. But then within this, Moses quoted himself these two lines saying this is what Moses was going to go say to the Israelites. And then this is just Moses talking to God. And then within this, Moses was quoting what the Israelites would say back to Moses, which is this line here. And again, all of this is what, and then the end here is what Moses is saying to God. And so Moses is quoting himself and also the Israelites as he's talking to God. Now, basically what Moses said here was God was sending him to the Israelites to lead them out of Egypt, and Moses believed that when he went to the Israelites were going to know what God's name was. Now, why would the Israelites want to know God's name? Well, remember, names had meaning in their culture. Names told you something about a person, or in this case, the name would tell them something about God. Egypt was a polytheistic culture. They had many gods. And so it was certainly reasonable for Moses to believe that the Israelites would want to know, well, which God is sending you to talk to us? And by asking God's name, the Israelites were asking to know something about this God that was sending Moses, and also something about the authority of this God that was sending Moses. Now let's continue verse 14. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And God said, Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, Moses said to God, what is your name? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Now let's go back to the chart that we looked at earlier. Yahweh's name means He is. The first person singular version of that is I am. You know, when people refer to God, they would use the third person singular, He is. When God would refer to Himself, He would use the first person singular. God would say, I am. Or again, if you think about it technically, the technical meaning of the name, men would say, well, God continually is. And when God was referring to Himself, He would say that I am the one who continually is. What we have here is when Moses said to God, what is your name? God's first response to Moses was to say, I am who I am. Another way to think about this is God said, I continually exist because I continually exist. In other words, unlike Moses, who existed because his parents brought him into existence, and unlike every other human that's ever lived, and unlike every other living plant or animal or bird or fish that's ever lived on the earth, you know, every living thing on earth was brought into existence by someone or something else. Every inanimate object was brought into existence by someone or something else. God is different. God was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And so God's answer to Moses was, I am the one who exists simply because I exist. And God was identifying Himself as the God that was named Yahweh way back after Enoch very early in human history. And then down here, God clearly says, I am. I am the one who exists. I am the one who continually exists, and I am the one sending you to the Israelites. What this tells us is God was staking His claim as the Creator, and as the Creator, God had authority to tell Moses what to do. He also had authority to tell the Israelites what to do. Now let's keep going, verse 15. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. Yahweh is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. Now these lines in here is what Moses was supposed to say to the Israelites. These two lines is what God said here to Moses. God said to Moses, Yahweh is my name forever. Yahweh is my memorial name. And indeed, at that time and even till today, Yahweh is the most sacred name we have for God. Verse 16. Again, God is speaking to Moses. Moses, go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And again, notice the quote within a quote within a quote. This is God talking to Moses. And within that, God was telling Moses, well, go say this. And then as you're saying this, you're going to tell the Israelites, well, God has said this. Again, we have a quote within a quote within a quote. Verse 17. And again, this is Yahweh speaking. And this is the message that Moses was supposed to give to the Israelites from Yahweh. So I said, I will bring you Israelites up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites will pay heed to what you say, Moses, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to the king, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now, please let us Israelites go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to Yahweh, our God. And again, notice the use of Yahweh, the use of God's sacred name. Now, that's as far as we're going to read in the book of Exodus today. Now, this concept of God's name also comes up in the New Testament in the Gospel of John. And this is from John 8. And this is Jesus talking to the Jews. And Jesus answered the Jews, saying, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." Now, keep in mind, Jesus was on earth 2,000 years after Abraham. And Jesus said, well, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and Abraham saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to Jesus, well, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to the Jews, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. And notice the words, I am. At this point, Jesus was claiming to be God. Throughout the whole Old Testament, the Jews understood that Yahweh was the personal name for God. They understood that Yahweh referred to the one and only God. Yahweh referred to the creator of the universe. Yahweh referred to the one and only God who has no beginning, the one and only living thing that has ever existed that has no beginning and that was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And here, Jesus identified himself as God when he said, I am. And again, this tells us Jesus was the creator. That means Jesus has authority. Now, let's review what we've seen in this video. We started in Genesis, and we saw that very early in human history, men grasped the concept that unlike every human and unlike all the animals who were brought into existence by someone else, they understood that unlike that, God was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And so they named him Yahweh to capture that truth about God's existence. And that's also a truth that differentiates God from you and I. And again, we saw that tells us that names meant things in their culture. Names had meaning. Names told you something about God or person. And then we read in Exodus about the burning bush. Moses saw a bush that was burning, but it was not burned up. And when he was at the burning bush, Moses had a conversation with God, and God identified himself as Yahweh, the one who has no beginning, the one who was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And then we looked at John chapter 8 and see that Jesus identified himself as I am. Jesus identified himself as the one and only God, the one and only living thing that was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And what this tells us is there's a huge gap between God's existence and our existence. You and I were brought into existence by someone else. Every other living thing on earth was brought into existence by someone else. Every inanimate thing on earth was brought into existence by someone or something else. But God is different. God was not brought into existence by anyone or anything else. And so God is not like us. God exists on a much, much higher level than we exist. And so I don't believe that it's correct to think of God as a snuggly, cuddly teddy bear who's here to always comfort us at our beck and call and do what we want him to do. Instead, God is Yahweh, and God is an authority figure. God has power. He has the right to tell us what to do and how to live. Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. Bible Mountain exists to develop biblically literate Christians because the Bible is from God, and each one of us is accountable to God for knowing and following the Bible. It is in our best interest to learn as much about the Bible as we possibly can. If you'd like to increase your biblical literacy and be a biblically literate Christian, please join my email list so you can receive future videos via email for free. There are links on this video screen to take you to a sign-up page, or you can go to BibleMountain.com and click on follow. This is a free subscription, and your email address will not be sold nor given away. Also, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like this video and share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.